Before sirens, apps, and flashing boards, small towns spoke in softer ways, bells with measured strikes, lanterns dipped once and again, ribbons under latches, broom angles on doorsteps, a single mirror flash from a hill. This series drifts through that gentle code, how villagers warned of fire without panic, marked thin ice with a loop of cloth, set tide poles and ferry hats to quietly steer strangers, and turned shops, schools, courtyards, and headlands into a calm, readable language. Expect cozy, sleep-friendly chapters, fog bells and day marks, bucket lines and oven flags, sail loft whispers, forest blazes, schoolhouse drills, and the rope grammar of ferries, told in low voices that won't rattle the room. It's boring history on purpose, steady rhythms, warm details, and practical kindness, made to settle your mind like a boat in a sheltered gut. If this kind of quiet helps you unwind, subscribe and turn on the bell, so the next gentle signal finds you right on time. Coasts learned early that warning at sea must be clear without being cruel. A village might survive a muddled bell in the square. A ship would not. So the headland kept the cleanest grammar, lights that repeated themselves until sleep could read them, bells that counted distance instead of drama, shapes in daylight so definite even a tired helmsman could steer by them after a bad night and call it skill rather than luck. If you stood under the tower on a winter evening, you could hear the whole alphabet arranging the horizon into sense. Steady sweep, measured clang, the hush between. Day's language began with shape. Long before prisms and kerosene, keepers set wooden towers with bold tops, cones, cylinders, balls, black against cloud, white against rock, red where snow erased the world. A cone point up on the east point, a cylinder on the west, day marks you could carry in your head when fog forgot to be honest. Each cape kept a habit that did not change with gossip. Children drew them in primers, cone here, drum there, and felt the coast become a sentence with punctuation sturdy enough to hold a gale. Sound kept company with shape. Fog bells lived in houses that had learned to be humble, small huts with a louver, or iron frames that took the sea's breath and gave it back as a measured note. Some rang on clockwork, weights lowered the way bread dough lowers in a bowl, others on wave action. A frame rocked, and a hammer met bronze. The point was not to shout. It was to count. 2 strokes, rest. 2 strokes, rest, north point. 3 strokes, rest. 1 stroke, rest, bell on the outer ledge. Keepers kept a slate inside the door with the day's intention. 3 and 1 if fog at tide. 2 and 2 if fog outside only. The bell listened to the weather and spoke only as much as necessary, which is to say, it behaved like a good neighbor. Night chose light because light can be seen even when fear is loud. Lenses, first parabolic mirrors of beaten metal, later Fresnel's thin marvels, taught flame to become geometry. Revolving lights wrote private poems on darkness. Flash, count to 5, flash, southeast. Flash, flash, long flash, out ahead. Occulting, light more than dark, inner gut. Each sequence was a name. Each name saved you the embarrassment of being surprised by rock. The keeper did not play composer. He kept the pattern as faithfully as a baker keeps temperature. Ships built the patterns into their bones. A man off watch could wake to the ship's shoulder and, by the way the light visited the cabin roof, say, "We are a beam of the point and the bar will speak in 10 minutes." Close to land, signals needed manners small enough to reach single boats without tiring the village. The lifeboat shed hung its lantern where the crew could see it from 3 front steps. Lantern low, stand by. Lantern low, then high, launch. Lantern high, then hooded, recall. No bugle, wind hates bugles. The coxswain wore a scarf with a knot small boys could tie. 1 turn and a tuck, ordinary launch. 2 turns, bring oars and belts. Not laid flat, engines willing today. Modern help, old habits. People called the knot superstition until they watched a launch in snow without shouting. After that, they called it courtesy. Harbour spoke back to the headland with their own table talk. At the wharf mouth a tide pole wore white, red, black. In daylight you read it by eye. In the last hour of dusk, by shadow, keeper's lamp dipped once to show the edge of red if a stranger had asked and the gut had secrets that evening. Pilots used arms the way ferrymen used hats. 2 short sweeps, follow me. 1 long and 2 short, follow but mind the bars inside bend. An arm held high, palm open. Hold your water till this set slacks. I promise it will be kinder in 5 minutes. Far out, a pilot cut a hove to with a riding light at the fore and dipped the ensign once, twice, for a ship that needed help. The ship's yardarm lantern answered with the same, yes, and thank you. The grammar was old and the tone new, but the courtesy was the same as in lanes ashore. We are listening. Come in gently, storm season altered nothing fundamental. It shortened speech. Keeper's log in the drawer might grow briefer, bar hard. Beam dipped a thumb at first watch. Bell 3 and 1 from midnight to 3. 1 launch stood by. No loss. But the outward grammar refused panic. On the worst nights, when sleet wrote diagonal on glass, a second hand joined the keepers at the wick trimmer. The lamp did not care whether the helper was a widow from the rope walk or a boy from the sail loft. Hands were hands. Flame wanted trimming. The bell's wheel was wound a hair more often. A small kettle on the little stove stayed persuaded. And the lighthouse cat slept where the floor remembered sun. Ships sounded their own punctuation. 1 prolonged blast, 2 short, then the bell's reply. An agreement older than all arguments. Beyond sight of headland, signals grew taller in the mind. Radio would make its own empire later, but long before, the sea moved messages by light and patience. A pair of fishing boats met off the grounds and traded lantern codes like mother's trade recipes. 2 dips and a hold. We are hauling west. 1 dip and 2 holds. We are setting east. Mind the streamer, boys. A coaster, late for the tide, came in fast and dipped her masthead lamp twice to the outer head. No one ashore answered with light. The keeper never broke pattern, but the beam's sweep seemed to hold its breath for a fraction as it crossed the bar. No magic, only hope's trick on nerves, and the coaster felt seen anyway. Rex taught the grammar its humility. When a ship laid herself down where charts begged her not to, the coast did not add noise. It added sequence. Flag square over circle at the lifeboat shed. Men to beach. Bell steady. Beam unchanged. On the sand, a Lyle gun coughed a line across the wreck, and the breeches buoy started its quiet shuttle. Humanity moving by underwear and rope. Which sounds like a joke until you watch the 5th man come in crying without crying. Flares burned not to frighten but to place. White parachute, there. Red hand held, here. The village formed a line at the blankets and kept its mouth small. Afterward, the keeper's log wrote a line so modest it could be mistaken for boredom. And that is how you know a warning system is good. Not all signals were for ships. The headland also guarded the inland, turning sea news into village news without waking babies. If ice rafts threatened the gut itself, rare, dramatic, the keeper lowered the beam a finger on the first sweep only and hung a black cone by day, point downward. The ferry read the cone and tied red cloth into the knee rope. The school read the cone and chalked a dotted square on the door. Pairs, slow steps at the pump. The baker read the cone and switched to brown bread for a few days. The oven liked it in damp air, and customers read the brown and brought butter rather than complaint. A cone on a pole became soup in bowls by evening. Signals work best when they lead to small, doable acts. Maintenance had its own private language, because failure in grammar is a loud teacher. When the wick burned too fast, salt in oil, sometimes, or a bad shipment, the flame grew ragged at the edge. The keeper kept a lark's tongue of tin, a tiny trim tool, and taught it to tame brightness. If the lens showed a faint milk at one prism, the trace of sea air sneaking where putty thought itself immortal, the keeper penciled a dot on the log. Milk, lower west, 3rd. He told no one else, exactly. He cleaned it before the next dog watch. But his wife, watching the sweep from the kitchen, would sometimes say, "Your 3rd has forgiven you," and he would nod at the superstition because it was a compliment to steadiness. Daymarks grew folklore the way hedges grow sparrows. Children claimed the cylinder on the west point glowed in frost, that the cone on the east point straightened in gales. that the black ball on the shoal picked up and rolled like a cat on spring tides. None of it was true, but all of it was useful, because it made children look, and looking is the root of safety. Fishermen carved their own small day marks into memory, a chimney that made a crooked notch in the ridge when you were on the line for the cod patch, a double oak that opened like a gate over the channel when you were right for home, a white shed that lost its roof behind the church's hip when you were too far west. The coast was a book read by silhouettes. There were, as in all alphabets, illegal characters. Fools lit bonfires where wreckers once had. The village smothered them without ceremony and let the sheriff write the flourishes. Boys flashed mirrors into ships' eyes and learned quickly that grown hands can catch a mirror with more speed than boys can apologize. Now and then a visiting yacht embroidered the harbour with hornplay and was rewarded with a silence so complete it felt like a lid. The yacht left with a better sense of literature. Warnings are not entertainment, and the shore liked to keep its genre straight on soft nights. When weather forgot to hassle and the sea remembered mercy, the headland's language became lullaby. The light kept its count because numbers are a kind way to pass time. The bell, if fog had gone to bed, rested, and you could hear the ropes on the lifeboat crib click their patient metronome. Inside the tower, a kettle muttered. A book lay open to a page that always read better on second watch. The log accepted a line about wind at north-northeast, and a cat pawed at a moth without much intent. Out beyond the beam's polite reach, a trawler's deck lamp floated a little world of its own. Men in wool, steam from mugs, a hand lifting to scratch a sentence along the back of a neck. The village slept, not because there was no danger, but because danger had been given grammar, and grammar is a quilt under which even worry can doze. Villagers did not meet illness with trumpets. They answered it with small, legible mercies, ribbons and sprigs, candles and cords, chalk and habit, so that fear could see a path through the room and choose not to shout. The sick house was not always a separate building. Often it was any house that temporarily learned a second alphabet. You could stand at the bend in the lane on a winter afternoon and read it at once without intruding, a shutter a finger's width ajar though the sun was kind, a broom set diagonal across the sill inside rather than on the step, a thread of steam from the kettle going on too long to be about tea. Not proclamation, only a steady hand on the hinge, doors spoke first. A ribbon under a latch told more truth than a rumour ever could. White, fever in the house, ordinary and watched. Blue, childbed, with the midwife within or near at hand. Green, convalescence, food welcome, footsteps quiet. Red was rare and used sparingly. Blood loss, messenger wanted, no crowd. When physicians passed this way in later centuries, they brought their own flags. The village already had them, cloth torn from aprons and dyed in kettles that remembered onions and nettles more than theory. A knot in the ribbon meant leave parcel and go. 2 knots, tap once and step back, voice wanted. Ribbons rotted in rain. No one minded. They were meant to be temporary like weather and like illness, and their fading taught hope better than slogans. Windows translated the inside for neighbours without asking the ill to narrate. 1 candle low meant someone sat up with someone else. 2 meant the midwife, as ever, and then the home returned to 1. A candle set high only once, rare as thunderstorms and snow, meant summon priest or elder quietly. Curtains held their own etymology. A sprig of rosemary pinned at the hem said prayers from the street are welcome. A twist of yew, never used lightly, meant this house keeps vigil tonight. Spare us your news and we will return the favour when the wind changes. In many winters, the village learned to tip its hat to a curtain as if to a person. Courtesy grew in such gestures like yeast in warm dough. Thresholds became little docks where help moored. A narrow stool lived by many doorposts in fever seasons. It was not for sitting, but for parcels, broth in a littered jar, a loaf wrapped in a damp cloth, a sealed note with a piece of slate to weight it, chalk tied to the cord. A line was often strung from door to gate, cord or ribbon, sometimes the same twine kept for drying apples, so that packages could be slid close without hands negotiating apology. On that line, a single wooden toggle polished by fingers became a verb, pushed outward once it meant we felt your kindness. pushed outward twice, and we need more bread or wood when you can spare it. Pulled back to the door, let us sleep. Children were sent with toggles because the grammar wanted small hands and light feet. They learned to walk carefully and go home at once without gossipsitch. Kitchens took on chapel roles. A pot set on the stove with its lid turned sideways meant cooling for delivery. A spoon laid across it crosswise meant, help yourselves to a ladle for the next house first. Vinegar sat openly by the pump, next to a coil of rag. You swabbed the pump handle without making opera of it and left the rag folded neatly as if to say, we take turns. When shortages loomed, the apothecary stopped pricing. He turned his green window bottle on its side and set a dish of salt on his sill. Salt meant ask for what you need. Pay me in spring with labor or laughter. A dish of ash meant do not be proud. When both appeared together, even the most stubborn took their measures without bristle. Mercy lives more easily in small bowls than on big signs. Inside, the room learned to be a harbour. Chairs gathered in quiet coves. Quilts breathed like very slow bellows. If fever liked to walk windows, panes were open to the thickness of a finger in winter and to a hand in summer. A strip of gauze or muslin lay across the opening like a bridge for wind to remember manners. A pan stood under the bed to take the kettle's heat. Bricks wrapped in flannel remembered the oven and then forgot. Herbs spoke their discreet syllables. Time for the kettle. Fern hung above the bed to draw a better breath. A posy of pennyroyal near the chamber pot to teach air to mind itself. None of it made a pageant. These were monosyllables of care, and care reads clearest when it is plain. Night needed its own codes so sleep could work and wakefulness not grow claws. If someone was sent for, the runner's knock came soft and patterned. Two small, one long, neighbor, not officer, so that a house already full of listening would not spring to the ceiling as if alarm owned it. Lanterns were shaded. The watch knew the lane by heart and touched its staff to cobbles instead of door. The midwife had her own innocuous signal, a strap end tapped twice against wood, and if a window shade lifted and fell, that was answer enough. Words were kept for rooms that wanted them. The bell, whose deeper grammar belongs to fires and floods, learned quiet, too. 5 patient strokes were still for flame. For illness, the bell owned only one note, and it used it rarely, a single. Measured round at the end of a vigil day, a circle of acknowledgement that felt like bread rather than trumpet, quarantine. In its old, practical form, was a ribbon tied longer. It was also a lane that remembered both ends. Neighbours laid stepping stones where mud might insist. Someone with better lungs than sense walked the back field to tell the shepherd that the child who used to carry lambs would not today, and the sheep would need no reason to misbehave. The tailor pinned 3 little pins in a strip of black cloth in his window. Morning work underway. Soft voices on the street. The cooper set a half-made barrel outside under the eaves with its hoops loose. If a parcel needed shelter from weather, it sheltered there. The smith left a pair of tongs on the bench with the jaws closed. Do not lean into yammer. Tell me your need from here and I will hear you. The village grew elastic around a sick address. Elasticity is not drama. It is kindness without the noise. When the worst walked in heavy boots, names we hope not to speak, people did not deny the weight. They changed the alphabet to bear it. The church, which loved regularity, cracked its heart a little and moved to the lane. A priest tucked the collar of his coat higher and carried bread in a tin-lined box that kept both sacrament and soup trustworthy. He made gestures on thresholds and in yards, generous and correct, and he learned to nod into shadows rather than insist inspector's light. The school turned its slates and lessons outdoors under the lee of a wall and taught sums to the tune of birds. The chalk for the day's promenade wrote pairs by breath, and the smallest held ribbons that kept elbows from learning bad friendships. The inn slid broth across its counter with the same modest flair with which it slid ale in easier months. Grief was not denied, and neither was laughter. It was trimmed to a key the sick could bear. Burial wore a grammar as old as stone. Nothing was hurried, but nothing lingered longer than kindness. A sprig of ivy on the oven door, tied with twine, meant a hearth would loan heat to a neighbour too tired to bake the funeral loaf. A broom bristles up beside a doorway meant pall hands were already chosen. Bristles down meant send steady shoulders if you can. A small mirror was turned to the wall until sunset. Candles spoke in pairs and then in singletons and then not at all, and the bell, whose voice can injure if forced, kept to one low, ritual note no louder than a sigh pressed into bronze. The graveyard gate wore rosemary. The path wore footprints in pairs. Stories wore their gentlest coats and were folded afterward, not put away. When illness thinned at last, the village did not return to noise all at once. Signals unspoke themselves in order, the way a harbour unwinds after a squall. Ribbons came down and became rag. Herbs left the window and went to compost, which is a way of saying nothing is wasted. Candles retreated to lamp and lamp to cupboard. Toggles slid back to their hooks and enjoyed an afternoon of being only wood. The curtained window opened to a breadth of palm and then to an arm width and then, a day later, to summer. People practiced forgetting without abandoning memory. The apothecary stood his green bottle upright and laid the salt back in its jar. The priest left the bread tin to warm beside ordinary loaves and went to mend a fence with a hammer borrowed from a hand that had once knocked. Twice, and once, what remained was the grammar itself, polished by use, ready for whatever the next year tried to pronounce. Children kept the little rhymes and used them on their dolls. Old women, who remember more alphabets than most, tied blue ribbons for neighbours before neighbours asked, and unknotted them with a ceremony so plain it might as well have been wind. On evenings when windows held the light of supper and not of watchfulness, people still nodded to curtains, still felt for toggles on hooks with their eyes, still scrubbed a pump handle because the vinegar sat there and the rag sat there, and doing nothing is sometimes not the kindest way to be calm. The village had two horizons, the sea that told its stories in plain sight, and the woods that kept theirs quieter. Between hedges and trunks lay an alphabet older than ink, bark blazes, feather slips on thorns, straw knots, whistle calls, and the angle of an axe left sleeping in a stump. Farmers and foresters read it without thinking. Travellers learned by walking slowly. Children were shown only what would save them. The rest they absorbed the way moss absorbs footsteps. Paths wore their grammar in small surgeries. A blaze on a beach, shallow oval. Pale wood winking meant way through. Two blazes, one above the other, meant turn here, with the upper blaze shifted toward the new direction so you could feel the bend even in fog. Three blazes in a triangle, low on the trunk where children's eyes live, meant keep the little one's hands. On pines the sign shifted to notches. One clean notch, safe footway. Two, cart passable when dry. Three, horses only with patience. Where would bled resin freely, the keeper shave his marks thin and scallop the lower edge. Rain sheds off truth better when it's given a collar. Shepherd country braided its warnings into wind. Whistles carried farther than shouts and did less harm to birds. A high, thin note, a third above a kettle's first thought, meant dog to the flank. A rounder one, dog to heel. A stitched pair of short notes, llama down. All eyes quiet. Two long, low notes, separated by a count of 7, belong to storm. Bring the flock down, fold gates, set watch at the pinch where gorse grips the lane. Shepherd canes wore 3 notches near the crook. Tiny tally of springs a ewe had bested with help. The 4th notch was never cut. After 3 rescues the ewe became a teacher, not a student, and was spared the worst weather's experiments. Charcoal burners lived deeper in the grammar. Their huts nested like dark commas among birch and alder. They raised round kilns, earth-clad mounds breathing through little mouths, and kept them speaking in blue-grey syllables for days. The smoke itself signalled. Thread-thin and steady meant charge burning kindly. Thick and brown meant air greedy, closer mouth, and the burner's boot sealed it. White and frantic meant fire running. Call for water with 2 slow horn notes through the grove, never 3. The horn was a cow's, bored to voice. Its sound everyone knew from market days. Deep in trees it stopped voices from spooking the fire into worse manners. Woodcutters used metal like punctuation. An axe planted blade first in a stump with the haft leaning toward the path meant men felling. Pass wide. Half leaning away meant sawpit, look down before foot. A crossgut left on trestles with the teeth veiled in a rag said, "Come steady, mend or help." The same saw with the rag tied in a knot around its handle said, "Gone for wedges, do not touch." When wind built in the high crowns, the forester chalked a ring on the butt of any tree he feared. 1 ring for watch, 2 for leave. 3 for we have discussed and chosen, a felling that would pay for bridges and shoes and a widow's roof. The tree was not a victim in this grammar. It was a sentence, and the village chose its verbs carefully. Beemen and herbwives stitched signs into hedgerow and ditch bank. A wisp of sheeps will caught on a blackthorn with a single barbed feather tucked into it. Jay, not hawk, meant berry safe to gather up to the second stile. 2 feathers, thrush and crow together, meant leave elder and haw. Birds are hungry, take slow only. Below the bee skeps on a warm wall, a shallow saucer of water with a chip floating like a little raft meant drought, mind the hives. A saucer bare meant plenty in the brook. No one posted commandments. The lane simply wore courtesies until they looked like lichen. Hunting paths shared their quiet. The keeper's boot turned a fallen twig in the notch of a stile to point toward fresh sign. Another hand, often a child's, set 3 berries on the stile's top rail, red slow, meaning do not follow at A. Run. A length of red thread tied to a low branch, meant snare set, not yours, walk high and loud and teach. Rabbits to live. A pheasant's feather stuck in moss at the base of a willow, switched its chevron toward a gap in the hedge. Those who walked soft enough to see it did not need more explanation. Those who didn't see it learned by startling what lived beyond and tried later to become quieter. Stormcraft wore its own small flags. In deciduous stands the forester hung a strip of burlap mid-trunk, forehead height, on trees that liked to throw limbs without trial when gusts came curled. Do not stand and admire. Go on. At coppice edges a worn hat, brim down on a peg, meant watch for springers where poles, once cut, could spring underfoot. Brim up meant clear footing. Children may collect deadfall here. In deep snow, tripods of 3 sticks, no more than a foot high, marked safe line to the road, each with a rag, red for stop and turn, white for shelter ahead. Black for river has changed its mind. Stay under trees, blue for midwife crossing, make a lane. Forest color borrowed village uses so no one had to learn a second tongue when cold pulled at their thinking. Fire season sharpened everything. When a summer ran thin and the moss underfoot crunched like old bread, the warden stopped cutting deep blazes and switched to peel flags. Strips of birch hung loosely, white in green, to spare trunks harm while carrying meaning. Women who cooked for burners and sawyers kept buckets turned mouth down by their doors. The sight of 2 appended buckets in a row meant river light, carry more. Boys were taught to spit once on their match hand before striking, a small defiance of luck that also kept sparks from travelling more than they were invited to. A tin of sand lived beside the tiniest hearth as proudly as beside the smith's. Everyone's house learned to be the forest's neighbour. Rats and wolves wrote their own notifications. Rat trails under granary boards shone like pencil marks. A farmer swept flour under the lip along one edge and left it smooth on the other. The morning wrote back with feet, many and hurried, set traps. Few and purposeful, cat enough. Wolves sent couriers, paw prints looping twice past the sheepfold and then thinning into long, uninterested lines toward the ridge. The shepherd read the loop as tonight, perhaps, and hung his bell low on the fold gate, bell tongue wrapped once in cloth to make a dull, warning note that called men but not attention from farther ears. Bells can be coaxed to speak to the right listeners. Even mushrooms had signals folded into custom. A basket set upside down on a stump beside a trodden bolete patch meant picked, leave spores to right spring. A twig laid across the basket's handles meant doubt, herbwife will pass. Leave them. A bit of white cloth pinned to a hazel, down the path a little way, said children within gathering, voices welcome, dogs leashed, questions praised. The wood had room for many hungers. The point of signs was to keep them from becoming collisions. Sawmills spoke with logs, not letters. A log skid set with its lip pointed away from the stack meant timber still green, Do not borrow for a bridge. The same skid flipped with lip toward the stack meant seasoned. Common lengths, ask and mark. A thin shaving, nailed to the end of the topmost log and curled toward. The sky meant windfall wood, free for the, taking to any neighbor who asks. The ledger for the chalk. The ledger was a board with names written in a column. Beside each, a mark showing a single plank earned or owed. The board lived under a little roof on the mill wall. The simplest roof owns a good grammar when put in the right place. Boundaries, where would met field, wore the oldest caution in a smile. A low stile with a peg under its top rail wasn't there to catch a skirt. It held a tiny slate that read, in chalk that vanished each rain, cow on left, bull beyond. 2 stiles down, the slate read bees, blue cloth please, and folk tied their hat ribbons blue for 30 paces so bees would read them as sky and not find a quarrel. A scarecrow's arm, turned 90 degrees toward a gap in the hedge, was not a scarecrow being whimsical. It was a farmer with twine and a sense of humor sending children to a path under the ash where the nettles had been beaten down last evening to spare bare legs. Thunder loved wooded village edges. When heat stacked itself like dishes and leaves turned their pale bellies outward, the forester took a circuit. He left his axe home and carried only an oiled rag, a knife, and a pocket of cedar shavings. He felt for trees with the posture of worry, crown loaded over nothing, roots sketched shallow in a skin of moss. He nicked bark low and tucked a shaving, cedar side out, where children could see it and say, not this shade. Not today. He cut thin flags from birch to put along a line he imagined. If wind came from there at that speed, this would go there. Flags are sometimes map and sometimes prayer. The village walked its chores afoot to the left of danger, and Thunder grumbled and found less to brag about at supper. Night folded the forest letters, but not all the way. Badgers read the path like monks, single file and without complaint. Owls wrote their small, round warnings and supper abbreviations in the fur of air, and mice, taking the meaning as personally as mice must, kept to hedge roots. A lantern carried high in a wood, moving smooth, meant forester or priest. Carried low and bobbing, meant someone tired. Make a clear answer. A horn on 2 notes woke charcoal burners for help. A single note, held, said wolves, but unhungry. Leave them their grammar and they'll leave you yours. Villagers did not wait for danger to teach their children. They let play carry the lesson before trouble needed it. The schoolhouse kept a second curriculum, a quiet lexicon of chalk marks, hand signs, bells too small to frighten, and games that wore warning lightly, so that care would feel like a habit rather than a scold. If you stood under the eaves on a winter morning, you could read that grammar before a slate was lifted, broom bristles laid across the threshold, half day if snow rose again. A tiny triangle drawn faintly on the door, ink day, aprons on, sleeves rolled. And a loop of red yarn tied loosely to the latch, frost, walk like readers, not like runners. Inside, the room breathed wool and slate and the faint iron of the stove. At the front hung a narrow bell on a ribbon, no tower peal, only a coin of sound used to thread the hour together. 1 light strike meant copy lines. 2 meant mouths sharp with questions could open. 3, rare and round, meant feet under benches and heart steady. A drill, not a worry. The bell did not command. It suggested, and suggestion, learned early, becomes the kind of obedience that keeps people considerate when weather asks for quickness. Chalk carried much of the code. Beside the alphabet lines, a corner of the board was always left for signals. A small square, ordinary exit, coats, and quiet. A square with a chalk dot in the center, pairs, hold hands if the wind thinks itself clever. A single long arrow toward the pump, fire practice, lids on ink, benches not dragged, door unhurried. 3 short arrows toward the inner closet, storm, a game of fox and cub to get low in the room without fear. When the master or mistress ran a finger through the square and the chalk smudged like breath on glass, the children felt the seriousness without being handed panic. They did not shout. They recited the little rhyme instead, the one that made the exit a cadence, book on bench, bench like stone. Coats find arms. We walk home. Games taught the finer points, how to see everything and say little. Lanternus walk made a lantern out of a child's cup hands. The lanterner led the file around chairs and slates, lifting and lowering their hands to signal turns and squeezes. The line behind learned to read the edges of light without voices, and when someone stumbled, the whole line softened so that the stumble forgot to be large. Bell and board used a scrap of wood and a spoon. The bell tapped slow, then faster. The board answered with knocks, two slow, one quick, so children would feel how patterns can carry meaning through doors. Even King of the Mountain played on the snow heap by the step, kept a rule that turned competition into practice. The king must lower a hand to haul each new climber up, so that crowding never forgot courtesy. And the heap never became a hill of elbows. Seatings and small objects bore signals that grown eyes could miss. A blue ribbon pinned to the back edge of the window bench meant the inside path was the day's route, ice under eaves. Brush past the stove, not the outer door. A length of twine tied to the back of a chair and looped around the leg of another meant a lane had been made. No tumbling there. It belonged to a child with a limp, who could count on the gap staying hers. A wooden token carved with a star, hung from a nail by the door, meant the older ones would walk the smaller children past the weir on their way home. If two tokens hung, one with a scallop scratched into it, the route would pass the fish house instead. Because smoke ran thick that hour and someone needed watching, the stove, Winter's teacher, had a language small hands respected. A tin ladle hung on a nail by the pipe. If its handle pointed down, the stove would be fed at the top of the hour. Do not feed it stories. If up, would scarce. Pull mittens tight and keep ink warm under your palm. A cork stopped a little whistle cut into the stovepipe. When the cork sat, quiet. When the cork was pulled a finger width, the softest, steadiest notes stitched through reading. Heat yes, steam no. Children learn to glance, not stare. To note, not narrate. To keep the rooms whether inside their hands, outside, the bell tower was not theirs, but the step was. The smallest practiced thresholds the way sailors practiced decks. They learned to put backs against the jamb if a strong gust came when the door swung. They learned to count to 5 before following another child down the steps, so that a stumble would meet air, not ankle. They learned, at the mistress's gentlest insistence, to put the broom bristles up in the corner when they were done, because a bristle-down broom across a door meant something else in this parish, and language wastes no sign. Each small act was a pebble in a jar that would not need filling later with alarms. Stories helped swallow the bones of warning. The master told the tale of the winter the river thought itself a road, and how the chalk on Low Bridge went from square to cross square, and how a boy, no braver than any, saw the mark and turned the milk cart onto the meadow track and brought milk late rather than frozen in a slow, beautiful tragedy. The moral was not fear. It was red. He told the story of the time the hill burned 2 slow flames, and the inn hung one lantern and the midwife laced her boots and tied the baby scarf around her hair and crossed with her ferryman while the bell kept its 5s. The moral was not heroics. It was everyone keeps one end of the rope. Lessons themselves wore signals so they could travel without raising dust. Arithmetic stones, little rounds from the river with dots of ink, lived in a shallow bowl. When the bowl wore a strip of cloth across it, stones stayed put. When the strip was folded back, the lesson walked the room, children carrying stones to each other's slates, offering a sum like bread and receiving a difference like a cup. The strip, not the voice, managed the bustle. Quills were treated the same. A wooden stand with holes for feathers stood on the windowsill. When an oak leaf rested in the stand, quills could ask to be sharpened. When a feather slept in the leaf's place, no, here with eyes for a while, not with scratches. The older ones learned codes that would never be written on a wall. They learned to coif their scarves a certain way on market days, corner tucked in on the left if they'd walk the riverside home, right if the lane, so mothers who looked up from stalls would read the day's route at a glance. They learned to knot a string in their pocket, 1 knot for send the lantern, 2 for keep supper warm. I'm sent for, so that if a runner met them and used their feet, The house would not stretch eyes too far in worry. They learned the village's few passwords, gentle as lullabies. All still. All still. How fair the stars. Walking their rounds. No mouth made a play out of them. They were not keys to a castle, only hinges that kept doors moving with more ease than fear permits. The school made practice out of weather, not theatre. On one steady grey Thursday, the mistress dimmed the lamps and asked the room to be a harbour. The back row grew into headland. The middle, docks. The front, boats. A blue shawl became the channel. She lifted a lantern and dipped it a finger, and the boats drew breath and stayed. She dipped again, a slow, courteous beam, and the boats went in 1 and 2 and 3, with the docks making room and the headland keeping its count. Laughter kept nosing through the play, but the play held its grammar, and when the lantern went out, the room went ordinary, and no one felt they had survived anything but ordinary cleverness. The point was not to scare. It was to teach wrists the weight of signals and eyes the comfort of reading them on time. Not all teaching happened under the school's roof. In summer, the children took their grammar to fields. They learned the hedge language. 1 twist of straw, nothing. 2, cow. 3, bull. Red rag, dog. Blue, shepherd. They practiced making the signs and leaving them neat. They learned to turn 1 pebble on a waystone and to put it back with the tidiness that makes neighbours patient with your learning. They carried water in a jar with a cloth lid and learned to set the porringer on top. Not the cloth, when offering sips, because a cloth weighted with pebbles meant rationing. And words should not do 2 jobs at once. This was not magic. It was manners, and manners are the softest, strongest warnings. Illness required different softness. When fever lived in 3 houses of the lane, the master turned the jar of ink labels backward and taught from memory for 2 weeks. The children watched and understood that certainty does not always require saying its name out loud. The bell did not change its hour, the boards did not shout, but the school played its part. The hand-washing rhyme gained a verse. Benches were wiped with vinegar that smelled like pickles and patience. The dismissal square on the board received a dot, and hands found hands in pairs when boots met the yard. A sprig of rosemary was pinned to the curtain's corner. Children left it there and touched it with their eyes only, which is a kind of touch that does not bruise. Punishments, a word the school used less than repairs, wore the same grammar of smallness. A child who banged a door learned the door's language. Bristle up, bristle down. Latch just so. The way a knock can be felt without hearing. A child who shouted learned to carry the bell's ribbon and to strike once at the right moment and once not at all when it would have been easy, and in that restraint felt power turn into care. A child who mocked a signal learned to set 3 signals properly in the yard: rope waist high, red rag, broom across a step, and then to take them down with the neatness that tells hands they matter more than jokes. Rivers taught villagers a careful grammar, every season a new dialect, every bend a clause worth reading twice. Ferries were the translators between bank and bank, men who could listen to water with their knees. Boats that remembered people's small weights as well as barrels' blunt ones. Ropes that learned to speak in twitches and slack instead of vowels. If you stood by the slip at first light, you could see the day's chapter before anyone wrote it down. Hoarfrost combed on the ladders. Tar-dark lines with white whiskers at their whipped ends. A pole leaned at a telling angle against the kiosk. Nothing dramatic. Everything precise. In ordinary whether the river spoke like a slow teacher. A floating log, turned lengthwise and walking nose first, meant the surface current had a tidy spine, good passage. The same log twirling like a lazy baton meant eddies practicing arguments. Take the ferry rope, not the oars. Ferrymen kept a hat nailed above the tariff slate. Its brim told more truth than ink. Brim forward, easy water. Brim tilted back, eddies about. Mind the pull off the point. Brim set sideways, no cross after dark. Travellers believed hats faster than they believed numbers, and the village approved. Hats have the honesty of weather. Signals were soft because the river amplified rude ones. At the shore end of the guide rope, a small stick lived beneath the lashing. Slid to the left, it said rope free, oars today. Slid to the right. Rope set, walk her across. standing upright. Hold a minute while I remake the hitch. The ferrymen's or spoke. 2. Held upright at the stern. 1 slow tilt left and back again meant ferry stands. A tilt right meant ferry returns. Crossed above the head meant rope fouled, patience rather than hands. From the opposite float. A waiting figure answered with a hat brim down, heard you. Brim up, send your side first. Brim sidewise, river in a mood. No carts today, feet only. 2 people who'd never traded words could pass such a morning with ease if they shared the alphabet of gestures. Winter turned grammar to science. At first skim, when the river wore a film thin as onion skin and sang with the feet of gulls. The ferryman ran a small test you could miss if you were proud. He cocked the pole like a bat and tapped the skin where the eddy whispered. The sound, silver tick or dull thud, wrote the day's first sentence. A tin ladle hung from the kiosk roof to read the air. If Frost took the ladle in a lace and would not free it after a breath, he chalked foot only on the slate and tied a loop of red cloth into the guide rope at knee height. So even a man with eyes on his boots would feel tomorrow's bruise before he earned it. When the gut glazed in earnest, spruce boughs were wedged between piles and floats, green fringe showing kiss the wharf if you must. Better to wave and go home. Flood season spoke quickly and needed listeners more than heroes. Rain that turned the river brown as tea and laced it with tiny wheat straw arrows meant fields had started to write their own letters across the surface. Debris, yes, but also direction. Farmers walked the high bank with rope around their shoulders like polite snakes. When the ferryman lifted his, or in that old slow tilt, they made 3 small changes to the shore in less than a minute. A wheelbarrow hauled onto cribbing. The tide pole chalked with a line and the hour. A gate closed with the latch head tilted outward, the latch's way of saying to the next passer, you may push from this side, but not the other. No one shouted. Even the dog barked in the baritone that meant a man late, not a thief. Bridges learned to speak flood. At the low timber bridge upriver, goat bells hung under the 2nd and 4th spans. In freshet, they pecked their tongues on iron, not an alarm, a metronome for judgment, light taps, pass, chatter, turn, silence, go to church and wait for the river to remember itself. The bridge rail kept a tidy set of straw marks tied with twine. The highest tuft out of the water by a hand's width said carts had margin. When straw drank and lay flat against its own reflection, only boots dared, and boots with care. Children made pilgrimages to watch the water crawl up the straw and learned without anyone saying that patience can be measured if you give it something humble to climb. Messages crossed on the rope faster than voices. A ferryman, halfway over in a fog that pressed the world to one color, could speak a whole paragraph by hand. 1 short tug, set the lane rope. I'll need a steady bite on landing. 2. Bring an extra board, cow pannier loose. 3. And then the rope thrown slack, horse in water. Bring quiet and no spectators. The shore answered back with that polite snake of line tightening twice. Heard. And we are walking, not running. In the time a man needs to get his boots wet without hurrying. The situation had been translated from a problem into a sequence. Afterward, when the horse stood dripping and ashamed and eating an apple the size of its apology, the rope lay down again as if it had never been a sentence. To tea-night the river made mercy out of lamps. A lantern on a long gate pole hung over the slip. Raised to full height and held, name and business, please. Lowered halfway and steadied. Wait, I saw debris in the gut. Broken into a brief dip and lift, shelter inside. Questions in daylight. Houses that watched the bank kept their own tiny contracts. A candle at a right-hand window said someone walking, keep watch until the pole drops. A candle at the left said elder aboard, open the door and keep the drafts polite. 2 candles together appeared only for the midwife and then were done. Because light is a kind of fuel and midwifery burns a lot of it without sparks, upstream, millers were fluent in river. Their sails told the parish stones dressing or grind quick while wind is fair, but in flood they spoke with boards. The weir wore removable teeth, a ladder of planks held by dogs and wedges. A white cloth tied to the third dog on the east side meant boards out too high. Backwater will find the low meadow, move the hay. A black cloth tied to the center dog meant we're slipping, send the smith. When villagers saw black cloth on a dog, they did not panic. They walked to the smithy, and the smith tied his cracked horseshoe on the nail with a sprig of wet willow and cane. Even danger, if you name it in the grammar everyone knows, finds it hard to become theatre. The ferry itself had moods that decent people learn to read. A boat sitting a finger deeper than yesterday with no one aboard meant somebody had kept her in mind with a bucket and not quite enough sleep. Bring a thermos and don't talk about the water. A scuff of white on the gunwale by the starboard thole told of a pole slipped and a man who would be stiff in the afternoon. Leave a heel of brown bread on the kiosk bench for later and a line of silly chalk fish on the slate for now. Small good deeds rode the current faster than stories, aircraft and engines, in centuries after. Would give the river new languages, horn blasts and flashing lights, but the old code fit under them like bedrock. If you stand in a fog thick enough to chew and hear a single bell speak 5 patient notes, separated by breaths, you will feel your hand find rope before your mind explains why. If you see a hat brim set sideways above a slate you cannot read, your feet will choose the bank path without a meeting. Customs carved this deep and not replaced by inventions. They are carried by them, translated, then whispered back when batteries die and the river takes the world down to one truth. Water goes where it wants. And we go where we can. Together, spring unknotted many sentences. Ice shrugged itself to pieces, each pane a note in a slow applause that reached from bend to bend. Children ran with sticks and learned how easily a stick becomes a spear, and how to point it down and keep the small lives under the bank unpunctured. The ferryman went to rope, then to oars, then to rope again as the river remembered its ordinary grammar. He rubbed pitch into the guide and the bike posts, and where tar darkened wood, the day brightened. He set the nailed hat to brim forward and left it, which meant nothing more or less than, welcome, but mind your footing. In drought, the rope spoke a new tongue, slack so soft it seemed asleep, and a ferryman who read gravel by colour. He would move stones with a pole the way a librarian moves books, and turn the channel into a sentence that had better verbs. He tied twigs into the guide in tiny boughs, 1 at the shallow he'd made, 2 at the shallow that insisted, and from the far bank a farmer sent back a little mirror flash from a broken jar that meant I see your commas. Thank you. The flash felt like a handshake you could keep in your pocket all day. Flood's worst habit is impatience, and the village's quiet code existed to outweigh it. When the water stood on the road like a sheet hammered by a careful hand, the ferryman walked the high lane with a sash of red cloth around his arm, not lordly, just visible, and stopped at 3 doors. The apothecary, green bottle laid sideways, tonics will go to the hill. The school, triangle chalked on the door, ink day becomes counting stones day. The forge, cracked shoe with willow, dogs and wedges wanted. Each door answered with a small, correct gift. He did not carry the river on his shoulders. He reminded the village which parts of itself were already built to float. Daylight brought another layer of signals, quiet shop talk that let a whole street breathe in time. No proclamations, only habits arranged so neatly that even a stranger could feel when not to put a boot. If you walk the market road at mid-morning, you could read a little book written in iron, steam, lint, and glass. The smithy began the chapter. Its door stood wide when iron welcomed conversation and have-to, with the latch caught in a leather loop, when tempering was underway and the air preferred silence. A small slate beside the jam wore marks most people learned as children: circle, oars and household; square, farm jobs; shoes and share; triangle, links and chain; hex, locks and fine work. A chalk dot after the mark meant wait in daylight if you can. 2 dots meant leave it by the bench. Your name in the pan. A cracked horseshoe hung on a nail, cracked toward the hinge, meant flood watch, because the smith would be weighing rivets for the mill or fixing the iron dogs on the weir. A sprig of wet willow tucked through that shoe said gate boards in, send 2 shoulders more, and men arrived without feeling sent for. From the rafters hung a strip of soot-dark canvas. 1 fold over itself meant coal good, 2 folds meant coal dusty, Leave your best clothes at home. Inside, hammers had their dialect. The bright, fast peal that drew children to the door meant friendly work. Hooks, trivets, a gossip of nails. The slower, bellied tone, iron set deep on the anvil face, meant work that could crack if startled. When that sound lived in the lane, hawkers kept their pitches soft and the baker crossed the street with his peel lifted in salute rather than speech. Noise is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply ill-timed, and the village knew which moments to leave alone. Across the cobbles the weaver wrote the morning with thread. A square of bleached linen sat in the window when warp was being dressed. Sunlight made counting easy. A darker square, undyed wool, told that weft was in and the shuttle had taken command. 2 narrow tapes of cloth, one red and one blue, hung from a nail under the sill. Red forward of blue meant pattern orders today. Blue forward meant yardage. Bring your measure. If both tapes were tucked up under the nail, the loom was resting and the carter's room smelled of lanolin and promises. A tiny bell on a string over the loom's breastbeam jingled only if a warp thread snapped. It was the smallest alarm in town, and when it spoke, a neighbor walking past often stepped in, warmed her hands on the kettle, and held 2 ends quiet while the weaver coaxed the brake to forget it was ever separate. Help did not need announcing. It needed a door on its latch. The brewer let steam do his signaling. In cool weather, a light, persistent vapor drifting from the roof vent meant malting was quiet and the mash would be tomorrow. A low, rolling billow that tasted faintly of bread, stout day. A thin, sharp-edged plume, ale. Send for small beer if your children's throats ask for courage. At the alley mouth a barrel hoop hung like a moon. If a chalk tick leaned inside the circle, casks were ready for racking. If the tick was outside, coopers were wanted and paid in both coin and pint. At festival, weeks a sprig of hops nodded to the hoop meant the brew would be kinder than last winter's. No boasting. Just the clean truth of a bitter made to flutter cold down the slope. The apothecary kept a palm-sized theatre in glass. 3 small bottles stood at the window. Clear, amber, green. Clear water the colour of day meant ordinary hours. Amber meant distilling, don't breathe jokes into the shop. Green meant tonics hot, bring cups. When fever walked the village, the green bottle lay on its side, a quiet insistence that medicine would go out rather than make family step in. A shallow dish with a pinch of salt on the sill. Meant credit speaks here today. A dish of ash meant no one will be. Refused, and both together meant bring. Nothing but a name. On days when sorrow thinned everyone's patience, the apothecary turned the paper labels on his jars backward to the room and worked by memory, an act that said, more softly than words, that certainty can choose quiet. The baker's flags were edible. A strip of dough twisted on a string by the door, pale and dusted, meant first loaf shaping. A deeper gold twist meant oven set. A twist bitten off at one end meant, by now, or send a plate for a pie's crust. A peel laid across the threshold already told the oven's mood. A second peel leaning against the wall with its handle wrapped in wet cloth meant share heat. The round kindness of a hearth widened beyond its wage. Children learned to read this more quickly than letters. Chandlers and lampmen watched the day's shadows like accountants. In their windows, tapered stubs sat in a row on a narrow, broom-swept board. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short, order taken. 2 short, 2 long, delayed by oil. 1 long only, glass shortage. Bring your own chimney. A wedge of beeswax was hung by thread. If it had been cut with a wire in the last hour, the cut stayed sharp and bright. If the edge sagged, warmth had tried the shop and the chandler had already opened his door for patience. A parcel of wicks lay in a little wooden tray. When the cloth cover was folded once, wicks were plentiful. Folded twice, thin, covered, save and trim. Across the square the cooper spoke with hoops and heads. 2 hoops leaned together like an open jaw, bring staves. Hoops crossed like a saltire, river boards. Flood work first. Head blanks stood in a tidy sheaf. A single, curved shaving pinned to the front said the sunplane's iron was sharp and the crows tuned. Barrels made today would sing if you thumped them. When shortage came of nail or oak, the cooper did not write a complaint. He hung a broken stave with a sprig of ivy through its crack. Every neighbour who saw it understood. Trade what you have, or wait with good humour. At the far bend, the potter arranged shards along his lintel. White shard face out, glaze firing. Red shard, bisque. A shard with a blue dash, kill pulling smoke wrong. Mind small lungs. A water jar stood by the step. If its lid was a porringer turned upside down, you could dip freely. If the lid was a folded cloth weighted with 2 pebbles, water rationed itself today. Bring your own pail and a humble face. A child, seeing pebbles, learned to carry her own cup, and in so doing, learned 2 lessons: thrift, and that warnings could be made without shame. The rope maker kept his sketches in fibre. Twine loops hung by size from a peg. The lowest loop forward, small repairs. The highest forward, hawsers. Both aside, splicing class at noon. A palm guard, buckled through its own strap over the doorframe, meant someone would be welcome to learn tight from too tight, lay from kink, grace from bulk. If a coil sat on the stoop with its tail tucked twice, it was not for sale. If the tail lay out and curled once on itself, price was a talk, not a wall. Ropes, like sentences, could be made fit for any ship if you listened to what they meant to do. Even the tailor kept a semaphore. A length of chalk snapped across the sill. 1 clean line meant measuring. 2 meant cutting. A scatter of pale dust under the pane meant fitting. Leave room for embarrassment and laughter. In the glass, 3 pins held in a strip of black cloth said morning work, soft voices. A strip of blue with 2 pins said sailors' coats, quick hands. A strip of red with 1 pin said wedding by week's end, wish them well and keep the lane clear of jokes. Over all of this, the headland light made its tiny, extra courtesies. In thick whether the keeper aimed his first slow sweep a finger lower across the bar. In bright, ordinary weather, he kept the beam steady and seemed nevertheless to nod when the baker raised his peal in thanks or the smith lifted a hammer with a pause that looked like prayer. People swore the light looked warmer on days when the apothecary's green bottle lay down, and whether or not such warmth existed, gratitude did. Bread delivered to the tower step. A coat mended and left folded on the doorstone when wind turned mean. Children learned the day's alphabet by errands. Take this note to the chandler. If the wax wedge hangs straight, ask for 3. If it slumps, ask for 2 and a smile. Run to the cooper. If the hoops make a saltire, come back by the ford and tell the miller his boards are wanted. Peer in at the weaver's tapes. If red before blue, tell aunt that the pattern for the shawl can be promised by Sunday. The errands were not only about goods. They were about a village staying inside its worry's edge, never letting fear grow louder than usefulness, and when danger did walk the market, smoke where it should not. Horse with no rider, news from the ridge that asked everyone to hear at once. The whole street swung its signs to the same key. The smith's slate wore the old circle for household, because buckets were needed. The brewer's hoop took no sprig and no tick because strong arms, not beer, mattered. The apothecary turned every jar label out, no names hidden. The weaver tucked both tapes and tied her belt to silence. No one had to ask. The grammar had practiced itself on quiet days so that loud days would not need improvisation. Knights asked villagers to be clever without being loud. When the bell gave its last ordinary note and shutters thinned the windows to narrow kindness, the lanes learned a softer grammar. Watchmen walked it, 1 pair of feet, or 2, or 3 depending on weather and rumour. Boots remembering where cobbles tilt, staffs remembering how to be seen without sounding like orders. The watch did not own the dark. It borrowed it and paid back with care. The round began at the pump. A chalk tick on the post had been waiting since dusk. 1 thin mark for each circuit promised, a small arithmetic written where even sleepwalkers would not mistake it. The warden touched the tick with a fingertip, present, and shaded a triangle beside it if the wind had shifted during supper. 4 bakers who liked to start early and brewers who watched their draft like weather. He did not ring anything. He let the pump answer with a slow, friendly sigh. Passwords were less about secret and more about courtesy. A single word could be heard wrongly in wind. A phrase was kinder. All still. Called the watch along the alley that carried the bakery's warm breath. All still, returned the alley in the baker's voice, save cooling bread. On the square, how fair the stars. Walking their rounds. Near the smithy, heat or bank. Bank and thanks. The words were old enough to have lost any sharp edges. You could say them through a scarf and understand them through a door. On storm nights the exchange became even simpler. The watch lifted a lantern once under the eave and once again. The house answered by shading its lamp with a hand and then freeing it. Light agreed with light. Sleep remained unpunctured. Shutters had a night dialect all their own. Shutters latched and quiet meant we have ended our page. Shutters ajar by the width of 2 fingers meant someone nursing. Soft feet welcome. Loud hands not. Shutters with a short dowel set in the bottom hinge gap meant elder inside listening. Knock on wood, not door. In plague years, when the village's tolerance for surprise shrank to a pinhole, a ribbon slipped under a shutter's edge told truth without ceremony. White for ordinary fever. Red for birth or blood that required runners. Black for mourning observed, and visitors spared the burden of figuring out how to be brave. The watch read ribbons the way sailors read water. Felt, not only seen, lanterns carried most of the grammar. The town lamp at the square burned a fraction lower after curfew. Not from meanness, but to teach eyes to listen. Wardens' hand lamps wore hoods that threw light downward onto snow and cobble, so stars stayed property of the night and not of the watch. At the inn, a pair of horn windows flanked the door. Both lit meant beds scarce. One lit meant beds enough. Neither lit meant the common room was warm, but the stairs were tired. Over the far gate a single lantern swung on a long pole. If it was brought down halfway and held there, travellers saw wait for word. If it rose to full and held, the gate wanted the coachman's name and business. If it broke into a short dip and lift, it meant shelter inside. Questions at dawn. The pole saved voices from travelling farther than sense. Knocking was language, too, when it had to be. 2 fingerprints on wood, once, then twice, meant neighbour, not stranger. A spoon on a rail, 1, pause, 2, meant midwife. The midwife herself never wasted her wrist on a knocker. She tapped a strap end against the jamb and the house was already awake. A constable, arriving where ribbon or rumour demanded, knocked with the staff's ferrule twice and then laid the staff down, steel to stone, and waited. Doors no metal from flesh. Metal says duty. Flesh can read as fever. The weight kept fear from rushing the hinge. Watch roots wrote their own short texts. A staff set against the baker's lintel, head toward the lane, told later rounds the first pair had passed at second bell. Laid the other way, head toward the oven, meant the first pair had been asked to carry a message or a loaf, and another set of feet should look in on the street where the lacemakers lived. At the cloister's postern, a willow switch was threaded through a ring. Set high, it meant brothers wake for flood. Set low, brothers lie down and will rise at matins. Do not importune. No one gambled who had the right to pull it. The switch belonged to the mood of the water.in winter. Sound travelled with extra manners. A staff dip on iron spoke like a striking clock. On wood, like a lullaby. The watch learned to favour the latter unless truly needed. Somewhere between mill and forge, the lane pinched to a throat. There the warden paused, listened past his own breath, and said the night's smallest sentence, all well, to the dark. He didn't expect reply. He said it for the lane's memory, the way you pat a horse's neck even when it knows you in towns that kept a curfew. The bell's last voice was not punishment but pacing. 3 slow, careful strikes summoned shutters toward their latches. 1 small follow echo, barely a nick on the ear, told the watch they could begin their first circuit. The bell went to sleep after that unless the hill or river wrote something bigger in the margin. When it did wake, it kept the measured fives and pauses that taught hands to reach for buckets, not blame. Taverns and alehouses understood how to keep warmth without training right. A broom bristles up against the bench by the door meant hot bricks for boots. Bristles down meant chimney sulking. We'll serve at tables away from sparks. A pewter mug hung by a strap under the signboard meant stew left. Travellers fed cheap, and the watch steered the hungry toward it without needing to bang on shutters farther up the lane. If a lantern in the second-story window appeared and then was shaded and then appeared again, an innkeeper's little lantern code, it meant company leaving with a child or elder. Make the street polite. Lanterns forgive the throat what it cannot say softly. Homes return these favours without being asked. A candle set low on the sill where a soldier could see it meant, we know you're walking. Your work sits with us. We prefer your shadow to your noise. The soldier tipped his hat at the flame, which seemed to breathe back, and the watch route took him past that sill last. So the candle could be put out just before his key turned in the barracks gate. Not kindness as in heroics, kindness as in friction reduced everywhere, and sleep shaving its edge against it. Children absorbed night grammar by imitation. They were taught to step their play to the lane softness. Hoops off at bells, voice games swallowed when ribbon showed. Games of hide-and-seek done with arms held wide in dim corners to become lamplight rather than shadows, and the seeker calling found, instead of got you. In time, those same children became wardens or midwives or bakers who could count a lantern's sway and know the mood of a house from its smoke. Animals learned it, too. Cats patrolled with tails carried like short question marks. A dog's bark was not a general alarm. It had dialect, too quick, rat. A long, conversational baritone, man late. A single harsh crack, someone running uninvited. The watch praised the baritone, discouraged the crack, and left a heel of brown bread near the rat barks as payment for labour. On rare nights, danger insisted. A shout ran the lane like a match, and the village went from lamp grammar to bell prose. Shutters met their latches. Doors found their weight. The watch staffs met stone with purpose, and none of it felt like panic because the long practice of quiet had taught every hinge its job. Even then, the first words back, once the bell gave its closing bracket, were the small ones, all well, lights in, sleep now, because the point of noise is to be rare enough to be believed. After midnight the village read like a page already turned. The square lamp had shrunk to the size of a coin. The far gate's pole had come down and rested in its bracket. The chalk tick at the pump had become 2, then 3, then its tidy complement of 4, promises kept, no flourish. A last round moved with the respect you save for the last chair scraped back in a kitchen where everyone sat long and spoke low. The watch set his staff across the pump's low stone, ferrule pointing toward east. A particular little signal saying dawn will be kind, and went home by the longest path. Listening to roofs hold snow and kettles cool and the slow grammar of sleep write itself line by careful line die in the morning. No one said thank you to the watch because nothing in particular had happened. That was the thanks. A ribbon was tucked back in a drawer. A broom returned to innocent angle. Shutters learned day again. Candles kept their wax for another night. The chalk triangle was rubbed with a thumb and the board took no offence. The language folded and waited, like a coat hung in the entryway that never needed to brag it was warm. Not every warning could wait for hills or tide. Much of danger travelled the lanes, hooves, wheels. Whether that preferred fences to cliffs, and the countryside learned to speak in nearer signs, chalk at the gate. A pebble turned on a milestone, straw twisted twice on a hedge stake. These were not alarms so much as edits to the day, little corrections that let work go on without surprise. Runners were the first grammar. Not heralds in bright coats, just quick people with good ankles and a habit of breathing through the nose. In winter they tied their news to their bodies, oilskin packet under kerchief, slate shard in a pocket for a mark at a gate, a whistle cut from elder to carry one thin note over frost. When the marsh rose, a runner left chalk on the post at Low Bridge, a square, pass, then a line through it, don't, then a second square just below, foot only. If the chalk had been fretted by snow or sleet, the angle of the gate latch repeated the verdict, pointing into the safe meadow or laid flat for no crossing. Children learned this the way they learned which boots meant Sunday. Waystones held a quieter vocabulary. A traveller might miss the ring of pebbles at their base, but a carter would not. One stone moved out of the ring said road sound. 2 said wheel ruts deep. Take the crown. 3 spread in a little arrow pointed to the wide cart track through a field that a farmer had given up to kindness. In spring, when thaw made liars of roads, a branch bent and tied low across a lane meant your axle will hate you. A branch tied high meant you will hate your axle and then forgive it, which is to say, it could be done with care. Bridges carried their own syntax. When the planks were slick with hoarfrost, brooms were left bristles up at either end, like 2 small, bristled exclamation points. If a peg stuck through the rail with a twist of straw about it, you placed your palm there and felt for a rhyme. Ice under straw, dangerous as a rumour. A tiny bell, goat-sized, hung under one arch at the ford bridge. In freshet, it pecked its tongue against the rim and sang a warning for anyone who loved a shortcut too much. No one wrote that the bell meant anything. It simply meant exactly what it was. Water finding its louder voice, fields spoke in knots and cloth. Hedge stakes wore messages in their sleeves. 1 twist of straw, nothing. 2, cow trespass. 3, bull in pasture. A scrap of red rag set where 2 hedgerows met said dog at liberty. Mind lambs, while a scrap of blue said shepherd at work. Pass inside his eye. In harvest, a ribbon of wheat tied to the last sheaf left standing by the lane told strangers that gleaning was blessed that day. The ribbon gone meant the poor have had their turn. Leave what's left to birds. Warnings and permissions travelled the same path, which kept scolding scarce and grace abundant. Mills used spin and stillness to talk to their parishes. When a miller set his sailcloths wide and free in a light wind on a weekday, it meant good grind, send your grist. The same sails, reefed small and stubborn in generous wind, said stones dressing, send tomorrow. If the mill stopped in the middle of a fair breeze and the fantail remained turned away from weather, a red ribbon appeared on the laneside fence, river running foul. Keep your horses out. At night a single lantern hung low in the lee-side window, barely a star, meant the miller was awake for flood and would shout if shouting was needed. So houses could sleep hard, crossroad shrines and way chapels, little roofs on posts with a saint who kept company with rain, wore warnings too polite to call warnings. A sprig of yew stuck in the thatch said one of the old trees had dropped a limb across the ridge path. Pass beneath with a hat in your hand. A piece of mirror, thumbnail small, tucked into the niche meant sun on ice. Walk like a reader, not like a runner. In plague years the saint's shelf held a bowl of ash and a pinch of salt. A passerby who had spoken to a house with a diagonal broom could touch ash, then salt, then stone, and continue with a steadier mind. No spell. Only a ritual that made fear obey a smaller grammar did iron towns that kept watch and ward. The night carried signs few noticed in daylight. A constable's staff leaned on a sill, head toward the lane, said watch still out. Keep shutters 2 fingers open. The same staff reversed, head toward the room, said watch home. Shutters may sleep. A chalk figure, triangle, dot, line, on the back of the pump meant how many rounds the ward had walked, triangle 3 turns. Dot 1 man added. Line trouble seen and spoken, which let bakers and brewers adjust their own early hours to the mood of the streets. The idea was not to be secret. It was to be sufficient. Storm carts, the broad-wheeled, low-axled wagons that carried stones for walls and fodder for cattle when the world went white, announced themselves with a particular lash of rope across their tailboards. 1 lash left to right meant free to hire. 2 meant already promised. 3, rare and spare, meant doctor aboard, and lanes cleared without anyone having to play hero. Along the road, bundles of brush were dropped at intervals during real blizzards, little tents of sticks with a rag each, so that men coming back from fields could count steps between known shelters. A red rag meant stop, warm your hands. A black rag meant don't stop. Cold is trying to be king. Markets coloured their day with flags smaller than a hand. A green leaf pinned to a cap said cheese fresh. A brown leaf said the same cheese, honest today, better tomorrow. Fishwives twisted their shawl conus to codes the river folk read, both ends in front, fish cheap and plenty. Ends crossed, prices fair. Ends flat and pinned with a spoon handle. No haggling, the haul was hard won. The spoon handle made people laugh, which was part of the warning. Storms make tempers thin. Don't thin them further, even inns used silence for speech. A broom laid flat beneath the signboard on a weekday afternoon meant room upstairs set aside for meeting. Keep voices low in the common. A broom. Bristles up by the hearth said hot bricks for. Boots, while bristles down meant chimney. Sulking, no more sparks. The hostler drew a chalk arc on the stable's outer wall, clean curve for dry hay. Broken curve for hay with a traveller's rein in it that would steam and sour if fed too fast. The arc kept horses from colic and men from looking foolish. Sometimes the land itself made a notice finer than any hand. Snow recorded everything and, to those who read it, told which things required care. Fox prints circling the henhouse twice and then weary, meaning the fox would try again at dusk. A long, straight thread of hair across the lower field and a scatter at the hedge break, meaning children should choose the upper path to school. The double line of sled runners over the ford at dawn, meaning the ice was merciful but thin, and to carry letters by the higher bridge. You didn't fix such warnings. You obeyed them and were grateful for a grammar that erased itself by noon. Couriers, those rare, fast souls who ran between towns with matters larger than one parish, wore their own small signals so the road could assist them without noise. A strip of white cloth tied above the elbow said message for the sick house, don't delay with bread and stories. A strip of red said magistrate or mill, clear the style, don't ask. A strip of blue meant river business, ask no one to ford. When they passed a chapel, they touched the post, left a pebble, and the next runner lifted it, counted, and put it back, a little stone ledger that said who had gone and who had returned. If the pebble sat in a shallow chalk circle, it said 2 have gone and none come back yet. Do not expect faces before midnight. At dusk, the road unspoke itself, chalk smeared by sleeves. Pebbles nudged back into their rings. Brooms stood ordinary. Flags furled. Knots untied from hedge and pocket. Bells, if any, given one last careful voice. Houses let light out in polite rectangles. A runner in from the east leaned a hand on the low bridge post and felt the day's last frost like a sentence finishing with a soft, correct period. He did not shout to say the marsh had been kind. The chalk square remained a square. In the morning, the lane would wake and learn the new truth, line through square or a second square below, and adjust its feet without losing its temper. You could argue this was all superstition, but the people in it would offer other words: thrift, courtesy, memory. A village with many signs did not think itself clever. It thought itself responsible for not turning every ripple into a wave. The marks made distance small where it mattered and allowed it to remain large where it helped. They let danger be recognized while still being politely kept outdoors. And at their best, they required nothing a tired person could not do. Flip a latch this way, turn a pebble, twist one straw more, lift a lantern once, twice, and once again. Harbours kept their own alphabet, signals that spoke low over water so houses could sleep and boats could think. On the end of the main wharf stood a tide pole painted in patient bands, white for safe water at any moon, red for mind your keel, black for the place where mistakes acquired names. Children learned those stripes before numbers. A hand against the post in summer measured growth, and in winter measured judgment, not past the red tonight. At dawn a boy chalked the fresh level with a line and a date, a narrow fact that made the day behave. When fog lay down and made the world a single grey sentence, the tide pole became punctuation, the tap of a boot against its lowest bolt, a small, comforting period that said you were where you meant to be. Flags were the wharf speech. No sailor needed a tower, only a pole high enough to talk to mouth and bar. A square of plain blue climbed in a wind that smelled like salt and iron and meant fair water. Ferry as usual. The same blue with a white cross, stitched thick so the arms read even when gusts were rude, meant bar rough. Wait for the bell. A red pennant at half height did the work of a raised eyebrow. Storm to the south. Lash what thinks it can walk. A bundle of 2 flags, yellow above black, clipped smartly to the halyard meant sickness in port and caution at the step. No siren scolded. Cloth and air managed the message with a courtesy that did not make anyone's heart run. On days when wind argued or went missing altogether, oars and arms took over. Ferrymen kept an oar upright in the stern like a mast. One slow tilt left and back to upright said ferry stands. A tilt right said ferry returns. Crossed over the head said rope fouled. Patience. From across the gut, a figure on the opposite float answered with a hat brim down. Heard you. Brim up, send your side. Brim sidewise, river misbehaving. In smaller creeks where a pole path replaced deep channel, 2 oars laid along the thwarts like closed wings meant do not enter. Ice or shoal ahead. When the oars were spread wide, blades kissing the gunwales like a capital T, boats nosed in single file and moved like handwriting across a careful page, not every sign pointed outward. Nets spoke inward, to the village itself, with the placement of their sleep. A fresh-mended seine hung at the loft door on a Thursday said there would be hands enough if Friday opened a weather window. A gill net laid in a tub on the loft stair with a scrap of blue cloth tucked under the top turn meant share this crew if the catch runs to the east. Ropes kept their opinions coiled. Tardark hawsers laid by the capstan in 2 neat spirals meant boats were doubled. No one untied without company. A single short coil set on a bollard like a crown said mind the chafe on cleat 3. A note to anyone with eyes and gloves. The water itself carried rumours. In slack tide, with the bell at its laziest, the harbour surface sometimes wrote a slow mirror of the wind you couldn't yet feel. When feathered cat's paws slid like shy animals toward the gut, a man mending a warp would set his palm flat on a plank and say nor'east, half an hour. He didn't raise a flag. He stood, looked up the hill where shutters were half open for weather, and the shutters answered by closing to a line no wider than a knife, acknowledgement without anxiety. In winter, steam at the bathhouse tallied the cold. Low and pencil-thin meant easy. A fat, stubborn plume that refused to rise meant air dense enough to blunt a bell. Keep close, some warnings were built into the wharf like good manners. Along the inshore float, a length of rope ran the boards at knee-high. A short stick tucked under one strand at the ladders meant rungs glazed, while 2 sticks at the ramp meant grease from the rendering shed. Mind your tread. Lanterns were hooded to throw light down and not up. So stars remained ownership of the sky and not of the dock. When ice stitched itself overnight to the inner piles, the caretaker wedged spruce boughs between fender and post. The green fringe told skiffs to kiss with gentleness or not at all out beyond the mouth. The headland made its own silent edits. In hard, whether the keeper lowered his beam slightly on the first turn, dipping the light a finger width toward the bar. No book commanded it. The habit came from a year when fog learned new tricks and the town paid gratitude in bread and patches. On certain evenings, when dusk took its time and boats came home 1 and 2 and 3, the lens kept ordinary height and speed and yet felt like a hand held out above the gut. No weight. Just the idea of steadiness, and the idea was enough. Bells learned the harbour's dialect. The point's bell did its round duty. A smaller, higher-tongued bell hung on a rope near the ferry slip. 1 careful strike brought the ferryman from his stew. 2 asked him to bring rope as well as oars. 3, rare and neat, called the midwife across before the tide turned. In snow the sound went short, like a word through a scarf. And the ferryman lit a lantern instead, hanging it on a nail so a woman walking down with a shawl over her hair could see there would be hands on her side of the water too. Signals were not only for fear. A line of white shirts on the far rail at the cooper's shop, hung low and close to the staves, said hoops had cooled and could be handled by any neighbour passing. A string of black socks above the forge door, 2, then 1, then 2 again, meant the smith would take chain repairs before Orlocks that day. A broom's head upward on the chandlery step said lamp oil had arrived. Head downward said it would arrive at noon. Laid flat and tied with twine said the price would be kind because the boat had come through weather and left some of its courage aboard, when danger truly came by water. The grammar tightened without becoming cruel. A yellow flag over black climbed and held. A bell spoke 5 in the patient key. The tide pole gave its level by shadow when snow took the paint. Anne or rose and dipped at the ferry. From the high loft a mirror winked even in thin sun. No one ran across the wharf. Running wasted footing and borrowed panic from the sea. Children were sent with messages that were shorter than fear. Bring the rope. The good one. Put bread by the stove. Tell the headland we see. The harbour gathered itself the way a net gathers, loop into loop. Not fist into air, afterwards the same signs unmade the emergency. Yellow came down. Blue went up. The tide pole traded chalk for a palm smudge and then for nothing at all. The tide found its thought again. A single oar was set just so along the wharf rail, a gesture a stranger would never read. That meant thank you to the boat that had turned and stood by without being asked. In kitchens, fish met pans with the sound that forgives hunger its haste. Lanterns were trimmed back to the smallness that invites sleep. The water kept its secrets a little while, as it does, and the pole, honest, painted, ordinary, held the one secret it was built for, today's exact height of safety. You could spend a lifetime near such a wharf and never hear anyone say code, and yet the place was written with it. The tide pole, the flags, the oars, the set of a coil, the angle of a broom, the hood on a lantern, the spruce bough at a pile, the mirror at the loft, the keeper's fraction of a dip, the bell's measured patience, all of it a way to keep people inside worry's edge and not under it. Children learned by watching because watching was itself a job, as real as heaving a line. Visitors called it quaint. Residents called it weather dot on a perfect morning, rare and impolite to wish for. No flag climbed, no bell spoke beyond its ordinary number. The pole's chalk had already been rubbed out by sleeves, and the oars lay thinking of nothing. Even then there was a signal of a sort, the harbour's breath, steady and domestic, and the headland, bright as a coin, idling at its work. The best warning system hopes to be bored. The village, hearing nothing but gulls and a kettle making its low argument in the chandlery, took this as the loudest good news. On clear days the hills held conversations older than roads. Stone cans topped the ridges like punctuation, and each kept a cradle of dry brush tucked beneath a lid of slate. A path, cattle smooth, moonlight true, threaded up from the village to each beacon, because a warning is only as fast as the feet that carry it. Children were shown these paths as soon as their ankles learned honesty. This way when you must, but only when you must. In summer, the beacon keepers, shepherds, charcoal burners, the miller's eldest, dried heather and furs in neat twists, stack them under oilskin and rehearsed the strike in silence. Flint, steel, charcloth, breath. The lesson was not be loud. It was be ready. By day, smoke was grammar. One pale column meant a messenger on the east road. No hurry, but sweep the steps and set a cup. Two short breaths of smoke meant a stranger with questions. Send the constable if you like, or at least the baker who can smell lies the way he smells scorched bread. Three longer plumes meant watch the river mouth, which might be flood, might be ice, might be a boat too curious for its own good. When the air turned heavy and the smoke lay down like a cat instead of rising, the keeper changed the recipe. More heather for brightness, less greenwood for sway, because clarity is part of kindness. To tea night the hills spoke fire. A single quick bloom and extinguish, lantern over tinder, flare, then lid, meant talk, not alarm. One sustained flame was an alert the size of a sharp voice. Two sustained flames, spaced by as many breaths as it takes to be certain. Summon help but not panic. Bring buckets. Bring wits. Three steady beacons refused ambiguity. Wake the headman, ring the bell in fives. Lay a rope across the ferry lane, and mind your sparks. Villages along the coast and inland adopted their own dialects. Marsh towns favouring slow, broader fires that wouldn't sink in fog, mountain parishes favouring sharp, vertical tongues that could leap a valley. Disagreement lived in the margins. The main text never changed. Between these formal words, they used glosses. The beacon tender might hang a shield, polished tin or copper, from a forked pole at noon. A quick tilt sent one white syllable to the next hill. A very old heliograph, sun as ink, metal as quill. Fisher villagers recovered fragments of mirror-off wrecks and shaved them to ovals. A good mirror could carry all well from point to point in 3 heartbeats, faster than a boy could run and lighter than a bell. In winter, when sun was lazy and cloud corrected everything, they trusted smoke again, stone again, legs again. Not every hill had a lonely eye. Some watched in pairs. A low beacon crouched above the orchard. Its voice meant for the next parish west. A high one perched on the bare knuckle of moor, intended for the chain that leapt ridge to ridge clear to the great road. A farmwife with arms like rope kept the low fire in winter and knew how to burn damp brush into meaning. A grammar school master kept the high, writing notes in a ledger no one ever asked to see but everyone trusted, for blows of north wind, smoke fillets, signal slower. Fuel mostly gorse. 2 foxes watched the lid and yawned. The entries read like weather poetry and were in fact a handbook. When danger wore a human face, the hills and the lanes agreed on courtesy. No one lit a great pyre for one angry rider. Instead, a lantern walked the parish boundary, lifted, lowered, lifted, from gate to stile, and the hill answered with a single wink. We have seen what you've seen. Do not feed it. For a band of thieves, the code reversed. Hills burned a slow, steady mouth of flame, while doorways stayed dark. The village turned into a low country of shadows where every window watched and no lamp betrayed a solitary soul inside. Bells kept silence then, because quiet protects as well as warns. There were days too ordinary for fire but not for attention. After heavy rain, the upper beacon sent a single grey stitch, 1 breath only, just before noon, and that meant dam fishers mined the weir. In first snow, 2 short puffs at dawn meant roofmen go early. The thaw will make cowards of rafters. During lambing, a lantern hung with blue cloth halfway up the western slope told the midwife where a stubborn you had staged her play. And the midwife climbed with a bag of necessary jokes. Signals borrowed whatever was at hand: cloth, metal, smoke, flame, a boy's long-arm windmilling because speech outran him. Fear sometimes asked for speed harsher than courtesy. In those rare hours, ice breaking with a sound like timber, lightning shouldering the hill, the river deciding it had been patient enough, the beacon keeper spilled all restraint and let the fire run big. Even then there was order inside the blaze. Dry furs first for light, then green boughs for a black plume that could be seen by someone half asleep behind a mill door. Then, when the first help was already coming, damp straw for a low belly of smoke that meant crowd here. Not there. Afterward, the keeper took his hat off to the empty dark and said sorry. Not for the blaze, but for needing it. Every system risked confusion. So they kept redundancies the way ships keep extra line. If the east hill burned a strong one and the west failed to answer, the north lifted mirrors. If fog made both hills drink their messages, the lane itself spoke. Boys sent to door scrapers, tapping a rule, long, short, long, that said wake the men who mind the ferry and nothing more. In years of illness, when hands were fewer and eyes were tired, the lightkeeper on the headland trained his beam low once with the full turn. A deliberate extra sweep he was not obliged to make, and the village paid him back in bread and a jacket that remembered shoulders. It was not written down anywhere that the beam meant help, but it did. In harvest years the beacons rested. Lids stayed shut, char in neat cakes under the slate, iron tongs oiled and dreaming. Even then a child would tilt a piece of mirror from the orchard's low stone and send a butterfly of light to the schoolhouse roof. The schoolhouse roof sent one back. 2 birds moved together over the ridge. And the village remembered that warning wasn't only about fear. It was about attention, and attention could be tender. On winter nights the beacon keeper stood with his back against the cairn and read the village by glow alone. The long barn breathing amber. The forge banked to a dull planet, the inn pouring one friendly rectangle onto the lane. The church lamp steady as a north star that had decided to live indoors for a while. He could hear the bell's mitten strike drift up, feel the slow thought of snow on his boots, smell the furs ready to speak if asked. Down below a door opened to let a dog out and closed quickly to keep sleep in. None of it asked for flame. That was a kind of victory. Once, a traveller asked the keeper why his notes were all so calm. No exclamations, no brave words. The keeper said, If ever my hand needs to shout on paper, I will have failed to teach the hill how to speak in time. He let the ledger fall shut, folded the oilskin back over the wood, and checked the sky for greed. It held none. He took the path down in the white breath of his own small weather, and the can kept its silence in a way that could be read for miles. When spring finally softened the ridges and the first fire was needed only to burn orchard prunings, the beacon boxes were emptied, scrubbed, and relined with patience. The mirrors were polished until they lost all memory of winter. The path was recut by heels and small hooves, and the code, barely used for months, was walked through once at dusk. One breath of smoke, 2, 3. One lantern lifted, lowered, lifted. One short flame held steady, then gone. No one in the village stopped eating to watch, but shoulders loosened a fraction without knowing why. The hills had cleared their throats. If the year stayed courteous, the beacons could remain mostly metaphor. If not, the first syllable of safety would be ready on the ridge, already spelled in light. Warnings did not always travel by air. They also lived in small changes to ordinary things. A broom leaning straight against a jamb meant somebody had finished sweeping and gone to visit. The same broom laid diagonally across the threshold said, "We are closed to conversation. Leave, but kindly." In plague years, the diagonal broom became law that didn't need a sheriff. Neighbors brought broth or bread, set it where the stone met the step, and backed away to the distance chosen by grief. Nobody knocked. Nobody asked for names. The courtyard kept its stillness, and the house learned to be a ship, shutters tied to weather, messages passed by rope and basket. Nights measured by another lamp's patient presence across the lane, shutters themselves carried speech. Fastened wide at noon, when sun loved the rooms best, they said, "We are under watch, errands without us." Half closed with a ribbon of red cloth tied to the hinge. They meant illness inside, but not the kind that spreads. Call softly, we may answer. A wedge under a shop door told you whether the owner had gone to the mill, wedge turned inward, or to the fields, wedge pointed outward. A slip of card tucked under the latch meant ring the tiny bell, not the big one. Signals saved nerves. They kept danger visible but not noisy, sorrow acknowledged but not weighed down with spectacle, roads wore signs too modest for maps. In fishing towns, a rope was stretched waist-high across a lane if the roofs above were shedding snow. An extra not in the middle with a strip of red cloth meant don't pass, work overhead. When the thaw turned to ice again by surprise, a loop of straw hung from the footbridge rail pointed to the safer side. Shepherd villagers kept 2 stones near each stile. One on top of the other was ordinary. Stones side by side meant ram loose, take the long path. You would miss such messages if you hurried. But if you shared the work they protected, you learned to read them the way you learned the ground, by ankle and breath. Water asked for a different subtlety. Where wells ran sweet but the spring ran thick after a storm, someone tied evergreen to the well post, safe, yet boil. A slat of wood painted with a white cross leaned near the pump only when the bucket chain had been mended. Its absence meant carry your own rope. On river ferries, the polemen kept a spare hat nailed to the kiosk. Brim forward for current easy, brim back for eddies about, brim sideways for no one crosses after dark. Travellers believe hats. When riders came with news, pace was the first sentence. A gallop to the square meant weather or fire. A walk to the headman's door meant politics. If a white cloth hung from a second-story hook, homespun flag of fever or mourning, the messenger slowed and turned his words sideways. Hail the house from here. From there, the answer came through a closed shutter, and leave the letter on the step. Clerks learned to fold writing so a thread could lift it without fingers. Children learned to carry baskets on poles, not arms. Hands remained hands. Fear did not make them claws. Markets honored quiet codes, too. A sprig of rosemary above a stall meant the seller had washed and would not touch coins without wiping them first. A sprig of rue meant keep your space. A basket turned upside down on a slab said the sea didn't give. Today. 2 candles on a brick by the butcher's. Block, lit at odd hours, meant send someone you trust. I must speak privately about a debt or a kindness. Even gossip, which can ruin anything, learn to move in a lower register. A glance at a broom, a nod at a shudder, a hand lifted not to swear but to say seen. Signals aged with their people. New houses borrowed the old habits because the habits had kept bones whole. The diagonal broom and the red ribbon solved arguments the way a fence solves weather. When a soldier returned and carried noise in his sleep, neighbors kept their doors a little more open so that, waking in the dark, he could see there were lamplights near and no one needed him to be a hero. When the midwife walked by in daylight with a shawl over one shoulder, women who had promised to look after elder children lifted their aprons to show they remembered and would be ready. Nothing marvelous, only memory trained into objects until the world could be read by anyone willing to see, once in a great while. A calamity demanded sound again, and the quiet signs became glosses on the louder text. Shutters closed, brooms laid, ropes strung, ribbons tied. Then the bell, steady, measured, merciful, brought everyone to a common page. But on the many days when danger looked like a thin film rather than a flame, the village preferred its softer alphabet. Doors taught patience. Shutters taught proportion. Ropes taught that a boundary is not a wall but a sentence, brief, clear, and easy to undo when weather improves. Villagers feared fire the way sailors fear the lee shore, quietly, constantly, and with customs older than laws. Nothing in the square shouted "Fire Brigade" in paint. Instead you saw pegs under eaves hung with leather buckets like red pears, tubs of sand by oven doors, a hook with a long ash pole in each alley, a bell whose 5-pulse voice everyone knew before they could spell it. The art was not heroics, it was prevention turned into manners, and manners rehearsed until even panic had to speak softly. Hearths began the grammar. A pan of clean ash set on the hearthstone meant embers were banked. A pan turned mouth down meant leave the grate alone, cold iron. A trivet pushed forward to kiss the andirons invited a pot. Drawn back, it told children to play their games 3 tiles away. Tongs laid across the fender were a narrow no. Do not add, do not stir, the draught is right. Above, a small louvered board hung on the mantel side. 2 pegs showed the damper's mood. Peg forward, drawer open. Peg back, smoke will mind itself, no fussing. You could read the louvers tilt in a glance while passing the door, the way you read whether in a hat-brimmed chimneys kept the village calendar. A straw twist tied under a cap said sweep tomorrow. A straw twist with a knot said sweep today. Keep your washing lines in. If soot fell like black snow on a window ledge, a housewife did not scold weather. She pinned a rag to the corner of her curtain. Grey meant mind sparks, black meant bucket by door, and that rag walked the lane faster than gossip. A chimney sweep's boys chalked quick hieroglyphs at the base. For crown clean, for flue scraped, a tiny X for bird nest pulled and paid. On thatched cottages, ridge ladders lay along the spine. 1 ladder said ordinary watch. 2 ladders tied, with a coiled rope between, meant that men would be on the roof when wind turned south. Straw drinks flame from that quarter as if it were a singer and south a song. Candles had laws as strict as tide tables. In lofts with hay or nets, horn lanterns wore wire muzzles that turned light into polite ovals. A lantern set on a beam never stood. It hung, hook forward, flame enclosed, not because hooks are romantic, but because floors are liars in old buildings. Chandlers cut wick square, no swords for soot to climb, and tied a blue thread near the tip to teach trimming to children who liked tasks that ended with a small, perfect heap. A candle stub placed upright in the window lattice said, "Bring your glass chimneys." "I have oil," and the opposite, stub lying on its side, said, "Save yours, I am out." Each message reduced the number of flames carried past sacks and ladders. Lofts and sheds spoke a sand dialect. A low tub stood by every door, not pretty but proud, sand clean, dry, stirred each market day with a stick to prove it was no mere ornament. Beside it, a paddle cut from barrel head, a flat scoop shaped like a bread peel, waited. In the rope walk, sand lived in wooden troughs the length of a bench. A boy dragging a coil would brush his palm across the sand each turn, not superstition, static. Over the kettle where tar learned patience, a lid of plank slept on a hook. When it hung on the nail nearest the door, the shop was in no spark mode. Wood brought to bench, not bench to wood, across lanes, bucket pegs held their citizens. Leather buckets were oiled like boots and numbered to households. 7. Miller. 12. Cooper. 19. School. When weather promised entertainment of the worst sort. Buckets came down by custom. Each family lifted theirs and set them by the threshold. Handles forward, a little parade that told the bell it would not ring in vain. A crooked grin of iron above many doors, a pry for shutters, a hook for thatch, a spear for burning lath, saved roofs more often than swords ever saved reputations. In summer, cistern covers were brushed. In winter, kept with a loose lid so ice could be broken with a heel, not an axe. The bell had its polite tyranny. Fire, 5 steady notes. Breath, 5, breath, never frantic, as if patience itself were water handed hand to hand. The first 5 meant bucket lines form. Second, ladders to roofs. Third, hooks to eaves. Fourth, children to doorways with smaller pails. Fifth, the baker to his oven. Damp the bricks, lend heat to keep houses warm while hearths went dark. A boy ran with a clapper down the alleys that did not hear well, ticking shutters, not smashing them. 2 quick taps. Awake, not alarmed. The keeper's slate noted the quarter, North Row, and after, the same slate wrote, in a smaller hand, the names of hands that brought their buckets back full of nothing but gratitude. Accounting keeps courage sober. Bucket lines had choreography. 1 line wet, 1 line dry, elbows bent inward so no handle bruised ribs. Call and response that sounded like a working song politely sung sotto voce. Bucket, thank you, bucket, mind the step, bucket. Smalls stood between bigs, passing hand over hand like a clock with many seconds. A woman with a bonnet full of pins stood off to the side, the pin mistress, repairing a line with string when a bottom betrayed its oath. No one romanticized the work when a figure with pins kept it from unraveling into theatre. Men on roofs never ran. Running knocked sparks into corners. They walked as if late to church, fast enough to mean it, slow enough to keep a hand free for balance and a word free for hearing. Thatch had defences beyond prayer. A thatcher's rake lay on each ridge, teeth dulled to humour straw, not punish. When sparks came in armies, men laid wet quilts upwind, not down. Downwind quilt catches falling ash. Upwind quilt teaches sparks to sleep. In barns, purlin poles wore thin iron straps at the points where ladders wanted to skid. Those straps saved more necks than saints ever asked to claim. The best roof wetters owned no magic. They owned muscle, a rhythm for dipping buckets. And neighbours who would stand in a line long enough that the last person could make jokes without losing count. Street plans hid their fire wisdom in plain rectangles. Alleys ran not just for gossip, but for lanes of withdrawal. A rope stretched low between 2 nails. Appeared when hookmen needed space. Rope with a rag meant. Don't duck under. Hot. Work beyond. Rope alone meant quiet feet only. Market. Stalls kept sacks under benches. Today's sacks rode out behind shutters when the bell spoke. Carts were turned shafts in, their escape already started. The tavern cleared its hearth and filled its pots to warm cold hands. The school set its smallest on counting buckets. Arithmetic learning to travel as lightly as kindling. Signal and response ran in cycles tighter than panic ever could. A white sheet, wet, went up across the inside of a window at a house 2 doors beyond the flame. It wasn't surrender. It was a sacrament. This room is wet and ready to be the room that rests embers and women and the man who forgot how to breathe for a minute. A broom turned bristles down on a step said, not ill. Not fever. Smoke. Keep your voice low. A sheet taken down and wrung and put up again said, we are steady. The bell, always 5. Always the breath, knit minutes so you didn't have to count them. And time, like hose, obeyed after the worst. The grammar softened itself in order. Hooks came down and learned again to be ferry poles. Buckets went back to pegs, oiled with a rag that remembered wine as well as water. The bell, which deserves to be washed like a tired face, got a cloth and a thank you in the sexton's private language, a thumb pressed into bronze, one slow circular apology for having needed it. The house that lost a room received chairs on its step by evening. Chairs mean, we will sit with you until late. Whether talking is brave or silence is. The cooper's hoops, borrowed and bent to pull walls outward, returned to his shop like soldiers promoted to halo and laid on pegs to tell stories to hoops not yet hammered to shape. The baker's oven-baked brown bread to make the morning smell like mother instead of charcoal, prevention, the most boring hero, went back to being 1,000 small things. Tinderboxes were kept by habit, not on mantles but on shelves you had to think to climb to. Matches sat in jars with lids that made a sound hands remembered. Children learned the curfew not as law but as lullaby. The word itself, couvre-feu, cover the fire, became the motion. A lid placed, a bed of ash turned down, the day quietly put to bed in the mouth of the stove. The watch staff tip found would not iron again. The chandler's blue thread at candle tips went back to being a little grace note that made a good flame easier. The midwife, who has her own grammar for nights, came by the corner house that had shouted smoke and left a handful of lavender on the latch. Because terror has a scent and needs another one to argue with, insurance marks came later, cast iron emblems screwed to walls. A company's brag that it would help save what it insured, but the village already owned the more practical emblem, neighbors' names on buckets. Even with marks, the bell stayed common. A policy cannot carry a ladder. A promise can. When the first engine, hand-pumped, polished, half museum, arrived by road and committee, the village made a place for it under a linter, and then it kept the linter swept and the pump primed and the hose aired. But it did not let brass steal the old grammar's job. Engines go lame. Ropes do not. Leather cracks. Hands seldom do when there is tea afterwards.